Greetings, my fellow travelers. It's an honor to be with you again. We're back to our usual format this week after a series of interviews with recovering addicts. We hope you enjoyed hearing from others as they shared their experience, strength, and hope with us. As you listen to the struggles and victories of each person, you may have noticed some similarities and differences in their stories. This week, we're going to explore just that, the ways in which the various addictions look the same and not.
Dude, what are you talking about? Why do I care about other addictions? And why is your voice of dissent always a New Yorker?
You got me on that one there. I don't know. And I apologize to anyone that is offended by my bad impersonations. But to answer your question, Angry New Yorker, there are several reasons. First, we promised you that this program would be educational, and I think it's important to understand that all addictions have some things in common. Second, while all addictions share some things in common, they also have differences, and the approach to recovery is a little different. In future videos, we're going to tackle those differences by speaking to specific approaches. Finally, our hope is that when you get to step 12 and even before that, you share your experience, strength, and hope with others. Others that don't necessarily have the same addiction as you, but your knowledge of the principles of recovery and some insight into their unique struggle might come in handy. Okay, let's start with some of the differences. There are two broad categories of addiction: substance abuse and what they call process addictions. Substance abuse is the one we usually think of first when someone says they're an addict. Alcohol, heroin, painkillers, cocaine, meth, inhalants, all things we put into our body to achieve an altered state of consciousness that we feel is more desirable than our usual state of being. Process addictions involve behaviors: sex, gambling, eating, the internet and social media, video games, exercise, or work, to name a few. One obvious difference is the physical effects of substance abuse. There are thousands of studies on the impact of drugs and alcohol on our physical health, and recently, with the prevalence of fentanyl, it is becoming all too common that the effects are fatal. We're not going to get into the details of the physical impacts here, not because they're not important, but in our experience, understanding the devastation that the substance is doing to our body is not enough to stop people from doing it. This is more of a spiritual and emotional battle than it is a physical one. Now, having said that, I will admit that I was pretty ignorant as to the physical aspects of substance abuse in terms of recovery. I thought that process addictions were harder to overcome because they are things that our bodies naturally crave, like sex, or actually need to survive, like food. And then I started working at a rehab facility. Listening to people's stories of going through detox and actually seeing it for myself, I will humbly admit that I had no idea what I was talking about when I said that it was easier to overcome a substance addiction. And that's without actually having gone through detox myself. Seeing these people sweating and shaking uncontrollably, running out of a group to vomit, having seizures, barely able to walk, it is brutal. But before I talk you out of it, let me also say that seeing these same people on the other side of detox is one of the most heartening and encouraging things I have ever experienced. There is so much hope in healing and recovery. It is just amazing to watch. So like I said, substance abuse recovery has the added challenge of the physical reality of withdrawal. Our bodies are amazing machines, and they adapt to what is going on in the world around us and inside of us. If we pump poison into our system for an extended period of time, our body adapts to the point where when we stop the flow of poison, it has a violent reaction to the sudden change. That's why it's important to be under medical supervision when you stop using. A trained physician will know how to counteract the body's reaction to the sudden lack of our drug of choice, and I am not exaggerating when I say it could save your life. When choosing a rehab facility, be sure to ask if they are qualified to conduct a medically assisted detox. As I mentioned, I used to think that process addictions were actually harder to overcome. Not all process addictions, but specifically sex and eating. My thought was that because sex is an innate, instinctual desire that ensures the survival of the human race, it's impossible to stop the cravings. So the addict is forced to combat their very nature and figure out how to distinguish healthy sexual desire from escapism or numbing some inner pain. In a similar way, what if your addiction is food? How in the world are you supposed to assess your hunger? Do I want to eat right now because I need sustenance in order to survive? Or am I desiring comfort because I'm in emotional distress, or simply because it's what I do out of habit? The last thing I wanted to touch on in terms of differences is the societal understanding and acceptance of the addiction. I see this as a spectrum with sex addiction on one end and workaholism on the other. Like Jeff talked about in his interview, sex addiction still carries a social stigma that says the person just can't control themselves, or they're perverted, or at worst, they're probably a pedophile. On the other end of the spectrum, we have workaholism, which a lot of people see as a virtue rather than an issue. She doesn't have a problem, she's just a hard worker. The other addictions fall somewhere in between these two extremes, and the spectrum changes over time. Alcoholics were once seen as social pariahs, but a century of education and understanding later, it's much more socially acceptable to admit that you have a problem with drinking. Social media and internet addiction is so common that it's barely seen as an addiction, it's just normal. Why does societal acceptance matter? Well, on the sex addiction end of the scale, it might be harder to reach out for help. It's shrouded in so much shame that the sex addict might never get help because they're afraid to admit they have a problem. What if they go to an SAA meeting and they see somebody they know? How are they going to break out of the isolation that addiction thrives on if they can't talk to anyone about it and find support in a community? On the workaholism end of the spectrum, who, besides a neglected spouse, is going to do an intervention? Who's going to tell you that you work too much and it's becoming a problem? And even if they did, would you listen to them? It's very easy to justify working too much, and with people cheering you on for your work ethic, why change? Now let's talk about some of the similarities. I believe that there are far more similarities than there are differences. It's just that we have different substances or behaviors of choice. The most obvious, sad, and frustrating similarity is that we're doing something that we know is harmful in some way, but we can't stop doing it. We know the negative consequences, but we keep doing it anyway. One of the harder concepts to grasp, especially in early recovery, is that the thing we're addicted to is not the thing our hearts actually need. We're trying to numb the pain, to escape trauma, to fill a hole in our soul. But sex, drugs, work are never going to fill it. That's why we can never get enough of our drug of choice. The answer is to figure out what that thing is that our spirit is really begging for. What caused that hole in the first place? I think 90% of the time, that thing, or at least one of the things, is acceptance. I think feeling loved and accepted is our greatest emotional need. That said, there's also the fact that there's an addiction gene that some of us are just born with. We already have the disease, and even the best, most loving childhood ever is not going to prevent the addiction. On the flip side, you could have the worst, most traumatic childhood ever and never become an addict. I feel that the most important similarity with all these addictions is what we can do about them. Obviously, the whole premise of this program is to understand and work the 12 steps, and we're here to help you do that. One critical task that you need to work on immediately is to release the shame that comes along with your addiction. Shame will keep you locked in a cycle that stokes the flames of your cravings. It is not your fault that you're an addict. You did not ask for this. But it is your responsibility to do something about it, and letting go of the shame is a critical step. You also need to stay sober. It sounds obvious, but it's the only way that you can let that yucky stuff that's inside that's causing the addiction to come bubbling up to the surface so you can deal with it and find some serenity. In the coming weeks, we're going to talk about armoring up our self-esteem, finding self-acceptance, digging deeper into our issues, making amends, and changing our thinking. That's a tall order, Phil. How are we going to do all of that? One day at a time, my friends. One day at a time. For now, get your inventory wrapped up. Next week, Chris is going to dive into step 5 and start getting us ready for that amazing and freeing experience. Until then, be well, stay strong, and stay sober. A life of serenity and joy is possible and within reach. We'll see you next week.